What is the best lever action cartridge ever made? What's the best one for you to own and use? Whether that's for fun or for hunting deer and elk, or maybe even dangerous game. Well, folks, there really are just two contenders for that title of best lever action cartridge ever, and we can simply go to popularity numbers to determine that. You've got the 30-30, which was designed in the late 1800s and became famous in Winchester's model 1894 lever action rifle. That's a sleek little cartridge right here, right? And then there's its bigger, older brother, the 4570 Government, which was adopted as the standard issue metallic cartridge for the U.S. government. If I'm not mistaken, I'm no great historian, but if I'm not mistaken, it was the first ever metallic rifle cartridge that was widely put into use by the Army. So, which of the two is better? Well, one's older, bigger, and more powerful. The other one is a little younger, but still pretty old, right? We're talking well over a century, and probably more popular in a broad sense of the word. The 30-30 is used by deer hunters across the nation still, although it's not as popular among serious hunters here in the West, just because it has limited range. But there are still purists and guys that just love lever actions that still hunt with their 30-30 for mule deer or elk or black bear every year. And in big woods country out east and in the deep south, there are some areas where they're just not much better than a good old 30-30 because you can't shoot much past 70 to 100 yards. You can't see past that. And the 30-30 does all you'll ever need to do inside that distance. So let's talk a little bit about each cartridge, dig a little bit more into its history, and then compare the two head to head to decide which is better for you. Okay, so let's start with the 4570 because it's the oldest, right? Again, I think it was 1873, don't quote me on that, but it was certainly in the 1870s that it was adopted in the Springfield trapdoor rifle for use by the U.S. military. Carbine models for cavalrymen were loaded with a 405 grain bullet, I believe, could have been 420, with a little bit lighter charge because the rifle was much lighter, the carbine I should say, than the infantry rifle. Those infantry rifles were longer, heavier, and typically were loaded with a bullet 500 grains or a tad more, full charge of black powder behind them. They recoiled a little bit more, but because of the extra weight of the rifle with its longer barrel and greater mass, it was tolerable, right? And that rifle and cartridge combination fought through the Indian Wars post-Civil War in America. It was the standard issue rifle and cartridge at the Battle of Little Bighorn when Custer and his men were all killed by the Native Americans there in that area. And used somewhat also by buffalo hunters, although they tended to prefer the longer versions from the 4590 up to the 45-110. The 45-120, which is moderately popular today among black powder cartridge shooters that want a lot of horsepower, was not actually invented at the time. So the 45-110, as pictured in the great movie Quigley Down Under, starring Tom Selleck in a model 1874 Sharps rifle, emphasis on the Sharps rifle's starring role, well, he accurately used a 45-110. Pretty cool. So the 4570 found its way into lever action rifles in the 1880s. During the 1870s, there was some effort to build lever actions with heavier, more powerful cartridges, such as the 45-65 and so forth. But it didn't really find legs, get a lot of popularity until the Winchester 1886 was designed. So that's this rifle right here. This one is a currently available model from Winchester. It's a really, really nice rifle. They're almost impossible to mount a scope on, so just don't bother, right? This is the purest lever action 4570. You can also get them in 4590, by the way. And with a variety of barrel lengths and so forth, Winchester tends to build different iterations every year or two or three. These are just a beautifully smooth, wonderfully balanced purist rifle. As you can see, nothing inside this one. We'll just work the action a couple times to be sure. Comes to the shoulder beautifully, runs fast, and they tend to shoot pretty well, especially these modern versions made for Winchester in Japan. It's unfortunate that they're not made here in the United States, but the good thing about Japan is they make a great barrel and their rifles tend to shoot very well. They're very focused on quality control and it shows through. So that's where the 4570 really took hold in lever actions, and it's stayed in relatively good popularity ever since. It was eventually added as well to the Marlin 1895. So this would be what, about 9 years after. Again, we'll just show you the action is empty on this rifle. This is more popular now among serious hunters than the Winchester 1886 is for a few reasons. When the action is closed, it's pretty hard for any debris or whatnot to get in there. You can take the bolt out, actually, if you know these rifles, clean them from the rear. But most importantly, and probably the biggest reason for their popularity, is that they have a solid top receiver rather than an open top like the Winchester, and it's easy to mount optics on them, whether you put it straight above the action or a forward mounted scope on a scout rail like this one. This is one of the new Marlins made under the Ruger umbrella. It's the guide rifle model with an 18-inch barrel, shoots wonderfully, and is a really good all-around choice for anything from deer hunting in big woods country, elk hunting in close cover, and even hunting for the big bears. A lot of guides in Alaska like this model because it's got a lot of authority and holds a lot of ammo and is easy to run fast in dicey conditions. That rifle also is available in 3030 with a little bit different profile barrel, lighter, right? And the action is very, very similar, but it's called the Model 336. Back to the 4570. So what can it do? Well, the cartridge generally shoots bullets from about 300 grains up to about 500 grains. And there are some outliers. You can now get monometal bullets such as Hornady's 250 grain monoflex that are lighter than that 300 grain traditional standard. And you can go all the way up to a big heavy hitting bullet such as a 550 grain gas check bullet with a flat me-plat. That's that big nose, the big flat nose on it. Those are terrific if you're doing defense work against big coastal brown bears, and you need to be able to shoot all the way through one stem to stern, breaking and destroying everything in its path. Those kick a lot, folks. We'll talk about some recoil numbers here in just a minute. But really, as it stands, your most versatile bullets are in that 300 to 400 grain range. And I've got a little lineup here of bullets to look at. Here is a 300 grain flat nose, very classic, popular, typical bullet. Those can be driven in about any rifle to about 1800 feet per second, and in strong actions, a little faster. And you can shoot a 4570 in something like a Ruger number 1, or even a bolt action. I think they call them a Siamese Mauser, where you can run those up to higher pressure than a lever action can contain safely. On the note of pressure, let's take just a moment to address that. Because of so many very early 4570 rifles that were built with relatively weak actions, such as that trapdoor Springfield employed by the military, many, even most 4570 factory loads have traditionally been held to very low pressure thresholds. And even reloading manuals would generally have two different categories of load data for weak rifles and for strong rifles, as typified by these good lever actions. Modern ammunition, well, thanks to modern propellants, a lot of the modern 4570 ammo is suitable for use in weaker actions, but still achieves pretty impressive velocities. And hand loaders can do that as well. If you research and select the right propellants, you can get pretty good performance at very low pressures. But more and more, owing to the popularity of rifles like these Marlin guide guns and so forth, manufacturers are pushing the pressure ceilings a little bit. Generally, it'll be printed on the box for use in strong actions only or something like that. You can get right up to what they kind of casually term, or informally term 4570 heavy magnum ammo by Buffalo Bore and by some others, where they're shooting some of these loads at very impressive velocities. For example, Buffalo produces a 500 grain bullet at 1,650 feet per second. That's a lot of authority, folks. Let's go back now to the different bullets and talk about what they can do and what they're good for. Next to our 300 grain flat nose lead core bullets here is a 300 grain Barnes triple shock. It's got a great big hollow cavity in the nose. It's a wonderful all-around bullet. I've seen those shot into calibrated ballistic gelatin during ballistic testing, and they'll generally go 30 to 38 inches deep. That's wonderful penetration out of a big bullet. Very good for all-around use on elk, for broadside first shots on even brown bear, certainly for almost any use on grizzly bears, right? Interior bears that tend to be smaller than your brown bears and whatnot. Next to that is a bullet. It's a 400 grain flat nose, and there are a lot of different similar type bullets you can get on the market for loading your 4570. This one's a Barnes original bullet. They're built fairly tough. They're really, really good. If you want to shoot a 400 grain bullet that's not going to pancake and get the size of a silver dollar on impact. A lot of the 400 grain bullets designed for the 4570 are too soft, too thin jacketed for modern loads. They're designed to be shot at 11 or 1200 feet per second out of soft loads, and they'll mushroom and do fine at those speeds. But if you drive one at 1700 feet per second, it's probably going to pancake and fail to penetrate well. These Barnes originals are the better choice in that case. And then, of course, next to that is that 550 grain flat nose gas check bullet. You can cast these yourself if you have the equipment. You can buy them online. It's a great specialty bullet. It's not a good all-around bullet. That's what you want if you want ultimate penetration in your 4570. And then next to that, there's a bullet here and a cutaway. These are probably the most versatile and most advanced 4570 bullets on the market today. There's a 325 grain Hornady flex tip, and these are built with a squishy-ish rubber tip so that they won't detonate the primer of the cartridge in front of it when they're in a tubular magazine. It's very important. Nobody likes accidental chain fires going off in the bottom of their lever action rifle. Very dangerous and will destroy your rifle. Don't ever hand load pointy bullets into tubular magazines unless they have that squishy tip that's designed for it. So this is, of course, as I mentioned, the 325 grain lead core version. It has better aerodynamics than any other 4570 bullet on the market. Hornady factory ammo drives it to pretty impressive velocities. You're probably going to be getting, I've got a box right here. I'll just look and see what the advertised velocity on that is. 2,000 feet per second with a 325 grain bullet. And you get really good downrange performance with that. Next to it, of course, is that monometal version that we touched on lightly earlier. It's a lot lighter. It's 250 grains. Goes even faster, but it doesn't hold that velocity very well. Great choice, though, for somebody that wants to shoot a non-lead bullet. So what about the 30-30? How does it compare? I want to take a minute now to talk about recoil before we go into the various types of bullets and velocities that you'll get out of your 30-30. Let me consult my little notebook here. I jotted down some numbers before we got started. We're going to talk about a 7-pound 30-30 because they tend to be built lighter than a 45-70, right? And we're going to talk about 8-pound 45-70s, which is a fairly reasonable average. Okay, so in the 45-70 with a 300 grain bullet going 1,800 feet per second. It's a pretty average, achievable load, right? In hand loads or standard factory ammunition. That combination will generate 28 foot-pounds of recoil energy that impacts your shoulder. Now, just for reference, so that we have something that all of us can kind of relate to, a 30-06 in an 8-pound rifle, firing a 180 grain bullet at 2,700 feet per second, will recoil 24.5 foot-pounds of kinetic energy into your shoulder. So at 28 pounds, it's 3.5 pounds heavier than your average 30-06 180 grain load, right? Very tolerable. Most folks can learn to master that level of recoil. How about that heavy stuff, like that 550 grain bullet that you might hand load pretty hot, within safe limits, of course, but with, a pretty hefty charge for use in one of these 45-70 rifles for a backup guide rifle in brown bear country or something, right? So with the right propellants, you can push that bullet, or in specialized factory ammunition like you'd get from Buffalo Bore or Garrett or some of those others. That 500 grain bullet could be pushed around 1,600 feet per second. In an 8-pound rifle, listen to this, folks, it generates 48 foot-pounds of recoil. That is double what the 30-06 does. And it goes to show you how much increasing bullet weight can increase recoil. Pretty interesting stuff there. So, is it worth it? Well, if it's a choice between that or getting your ankle chewed on by an irate brown bear, yes, 100% worth tolerating that level of recoil. So how about that fine old 30-30? It's kind of a sweetheart of a cartridge. It's built in a lighter rifle that's easier to carry all day. It's more responsive and quick handling in thick brush. So what I did with that, because folks go back and forth between 150 and 170 grain bullets for their 30-30, I averaged it out, went with a 160 grain bullet, which is kind of perfect because Hornady's flex tip bullet, their lever evolution bullet, is 160 grainer. And I averaged the velocity to crunch our recoil numbers at 2,300 feet per second. Just a good round number for a 150 grain bullet out of a 24-inch barrel is 2,400 feet per second. The 170s will generally do about 2,200 feet per second. So we'll just split the difference and call it 2,300 with a 160 grain bullet. All right, what's our recoil look like in that 7-pound rifle? It's just 13.4 foot-pounds of kinetic energy that you have to absorb with your shoulder. So that's a fantastic benefit to the 30-30. If you're not shooting big dangerous stuff and you just really want to enjoy shooting your lever action, 30-30 is real hard to beat. While we're on it, and while I've got my notes handy, let's talk about the energy that the animal absorbs too, because there's energy that goes into your shoulder and there's energy that goes downrange, right? In terms of kinetic energy, which is kind of a flawed metric. It's really strongly biased toward velocity rather than bullet weight, but it's popular, so we'll use it for the sake of this discussion. That 30-30 generates 1,880 foot-pounds of kinetic energy going into your animal downrange, right? And this is right at the muzzle. That obviously drops off the further you go downrange and the more your bullet slows down. That 300 grain, relatively moderate 45-70 load at 1,800 feet per second generates 2,150 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. Now that doesn't sound quite right, does it? It seems like it should have a lot more on-impact authority than that 30-30. And folks, it does. It absolutely plays out in real-world use. So that's why I say using kinetic energy numbers are kind of a flawed metric. But it's popular, it's what we have, so let's carry on and let's look at that real heavy 500 grain load at 1,600 feet per second. This is, of course, only safe in very strong rifles, right? This is the one that generates 48 foot-pounds of recoil energy. It sends, at the muzzle, it's sending 2,850 foot-pounds of kinetic energy downrange. That's getting more impressive, right? But it still doesn't honestly represent what that bullet can do on a big dangerous game animal. For reference sake, and again, just to kind of showcase how kinetic energy can be manipulated, let's go back to our 30-06, 180 grain bullet, 2,700 feet per second, which is kind of the industry standard for that weight bullet in a 30-06. It generates 2,914 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. That's what it's sending downrange, right? So if you look at this, you say, well, 24 foot-pounds of recoil versus 48 foot-pounds of recoil. It's got half the recoil the 30-06 does as that real authoritative 45-70 bullet. And it's actually got like 65 foot-pounds of energy more on impact. Well, folks, again, kinetic energy can be manipulated by velocity, and that 30-06 load is going 1,100 feet per second faster than the 45-70 bullet. Even though that 500 grain bullet is, what, 320 grains more than the 180 grain 30-06 bullet, and certainly has a lot more practical, real-world authority on impact, well, the energy numbers suggest otherwise. So just kind of a fun little side note to keep in mind when you're studying the energy numbers. Okay, let's go now to 30-30 performance, different bullet weights and what they can do. So here in front of me, I got a 150 grain flat nose bullet. That's a super popular weight range for deer hunters. They exit the muzzle at about 2,400 feet per second and do a pretty good job, but I actually prefer the 170 grainers in a traditional bullet. Right next to it here, you can see there's a Nosler 170 grain partition, and it's got a blunt round nose on it. Still safe in a tubular magazine. That's my favorite 30-30 bullet, folks. It works real well because it's got that controlled expansion partition design. It'll penetrate well on an elk. Yeah, it comes out of the muzzle a little slower, about 2,200 feet per second. And it's a little more expensive to shoot because it's a premium bullet, but just a terrific all-around choice for your 30-30. Now, next to it right here, I've got a cutaway of a Hornady 160 grain FTX bullet. And this is, actually, I stand corrected as I look at it. This one is the all copper version. That's 140 grain Hornady FTX. Copper is a much less dense material than lead is, so it's about the same size as the lead core 160 grain version is, but being copper, it weighs less. It's a 140. I actually used that bullet, that copper version, to take two big black bears in Alberta over a decade ago, and it worked very well. Gave great penetration inside 100 yards. It's terrific bullet. It'll go faster, 2,500, 2,600 feet per second. The 160 grain version with a lead core, yeah, right in there between 23 and 2,400 feet per second, depending on what kind of modern propellants Hornady's using in its factory ammo and you're using in your hand loads. And yes, all these bullets are actually available as component bullets for hand loaders. So in practical terms, which one's going to serve you better in the field? It depends entirely on what you do with it, my friends. If you're hunting deer and deer only in, the eastern half of the United States, maybe some wild hogs thrown in there, the 30-30 will do everything you ever need it to do. It actually has a little better aerodynamics. None of these bullets are high BC bullets. They just aren't even in the same galaxy as modern high BC bullets for 7mm and 6.5mm modern cartridges. But you can still say, all right, let's draw some examples. If those highly aerodynamic modern bullets could be compared to an arrow in flight, right? There's just not much drag. Well, a 45-70 bullet is about like a pumpkin in flight. Lots of drag. Rainbow trajectory, slows down real fast, but makes a big splat when it hits, right? And the 30-30 is kind of somewhere in between. It's maybe more like a football in flight. As long as you put a good spiral on it, it'll fly pretty well, but you're still going to have a lot of parabolic curve in its flight. And, well, that's my fun little analogy just to try and give a mental or, a mentally visual picture of the ballistic characteristics of these cartridges compared to modern ones. So what about if you live in, let's say, the Carolinas or maybe in Wisconsin, and you hunt deer primarily, but every once in a while you might get a chance at an honest-to-goodness thumper of a black bear. We're talking 400 pounds plus, right? In that case, I would definitely go with something like that 170 grain nozzler partition bullet in your 30-30, just to ensure that you get through the heavy layers of fat, maybe a shoulder bone, and all the way into the vitals and through the vitals inside the thoracic cavity. Because some of those other bullets in a 30-30 don't penetrate quite well enough for a 400 plus pound animal. That's where you may want to start considering a 45-70 because it's just a lot more cartridge. And if you load it with something like that 300 grain Barnes triple shock bullet, big hollow cavity up front, but it'll retain all of its weight on impact, can be driven pretty fast. It's fantastic for the biggest black bears. It's good enough for interior grizzly bears. It's wonderful on elk in close cover, right? Good enough for moose. It's just great. It's a good bullet for about anything you want to do with it, except maybe stopping coastal brown bears. And then, of course, you have more choices. So to me, the way I look at it is as you move into either big bear country, even big black bear country, or west into elk country, if you like to hunt elk, and especially if you like to hunt elk in grizzly country, western Wyoming, western Montana, northern Idaho, of course, British Columbia, Alaska, some of those areas. If you like to hunt moose or elk or caribou or whatever in grizzly bear country with a lever action, I would certainly go with the 45-70 over the 30-30. Just an all-around better choice. And what you may have kind of deduced on your own, folks, just by looking at the little display of the couple cartridges and then all the bullets lined up here in front of me, I think the 45-70 is so popular these days that there are more options available both in projectile types and in factory ammunition, of a more versatile spectrum. So you've got everything from a 350 grain A-frame loaded by Swift, wonderful load, to the Barnes 300 grain triple shock in the Pioneer ammunition and a heavy lead core 400 grain Barnes original. You got the outstanding Hornady lever evolution ammunition loaded with the flex tip bullet that's got more distance capability than any other. And of course the mono-metal version of that, the light, fast 250 grain monoflex. You got great loads from Nosler and from Winchester and Remington. All the big companies build it. And then of course there's this serious dangerous game ammo as loaded by Garrett cartridges and Buffalo Bore, like we talked about. The 45-70 is a very versatile cartridge that's being well supported in ammunition and in component bullets on our market today. So, in the end, which is better, folks? The 45-70 Government or the 30-30 Winchester? It's entirely up to you. What you intend to do with it should help you decide which is the better cartridge. I'm Joseph von Benedikt with the Backcountry Hunting Podcast. Ron Spomer allows me to occasionally guest host here on Ron Spomer Outdoors, and I just love it. As he would say, folks, hunt honest and shoot straight. I'll see you in the backcountry.